Today's passage describes the dispute between Paul and Barnabas, both outstanding pastors and gospel workers. It was a serious disagreement. The Bible records that they quarreled and parted company. The cause of their dispute was Mark. Mark was Barnabas's nephew. Previously, Mark had accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey, but during that journey, he suddenly left Paul and Barnabas and returned home. Therefore, the disagreement arose over whether to include this Mark in the second missionary journey. Paul believed that one who had shown such a bad habit of acting independently and deserting the group midway could not be a co-worker. Barnabas, however, felt that he was still young and should be admonished, taught, and nurtured. Paul and Barnabas had spent 3 years on the first missionary journey, converting countless people and planting numerous churches. They were truly a fantastic team. Paul and Barnabas took Mark along as an assistant on their first missionary journey. Mark's mother, Mary, was the hostess who provided the upper room, where Jesus and his disciples could hold the Last Supper. After Jesus ascended, the 120 saints gathered in the upper room of Mark's mother, Mary, devoted themselves to prayer and were filled with the Holy Spirit. When Peter was arrested, they were praying in Mary's upper room. An angel freed Peter, and Mary's servant girl, Lydia, recognized his voice when he knocked at the door. Overjoyed, she ran inside to report the news and forgot to open the door. That house belonged to Mary, and Mary's son was Mark. Barnabas, the uncle of Mark, also known as Joseph, was a remarkable man. Barnabas's real name was Joseph. This Joseph sold his field and placed the proceeds at the apostles' feet to help the needy believers. Because Joseph was so generous in his relief efforts, he earned the nickname Son of Encouragement and came to be called Barnabas. That is why the Bible refers to him as Barnabas. So, Mark grew up in a family that was both financially prosperous and deeply devout in faith. Paul and Barnabas took Mark, who had been raised in a distinguished family of faith, as their assistant. However, the mission field was not easy. Just as mission work today sometimes requires risking one's life, it was even harder and more dangerous back then. Mark, a young master from a wealthy family, was like a delicate flower grown in a greenhouse. It was difficult for him to survive, like a weed in the harsh world, as a missionary's assistant. In the harsh environment, Mark became homesick for his house in Jerusalem and left the mission midway to return home. Acts 13:13 states, from Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. He had deserted the missionary team. In military terms, it was desertion. In fact, this wasn't the first time Mark had acted this way. Even when he was with Jesus, he had abandoned Jesus and fled midway. Mark 14:50-52 states, then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man, wearing nothing but a linen garment, was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Was none other than Mark. Thus, Mark had a history of quitting and giving up midway. He lacked endurance and perseverance. However, after the first missionary journey ended, when Paul and Barnabas were about to embark on the second missionary journey, Barnabas suggested giving Mark another chance. The text verse 37 states, Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. Barnabas was Mark's uncle and a man of generous character. But Paul, coming from a Pharisee background, was extremely disciplined and strict in his self-management. Therefore, Paul insisted that Mark should be excluded entirely. Verse 38 states, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. As their opinions diverged, they argued fiercely until they finally parted ways. Verses 39 and 40 state, they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus. 40. But Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. Mark John was still young and inexperienced, yet he was someone who had personally witnessed Jesus Christ. His mother, Mary, had embraced the gospel early on and actively supported Jesus Christ and his disciples. In any case, Mark grew up in a good faith environment. Under the care of his loving and deeply faithful mother, he received thorough religious instruction as a Jew and had encounters with Jesus Christ. He also possessed all the favorable conditions: the gracious prayer meetings and worship held in his home, fellowship with the apostles, and a prosperous family environment. Like a tree in a fertile garden, he grew vigorously, putting down deep roots and spreading his branches. Though he experienced trial and error, he later transformed into a faithful gospel worker. First, human conflicts primarily arise from issues of priority. Depending on the priorities a person holds, their thoughts and actions can differ. Some people prioritize work above all else. Such individuals are called work-centered people. Others, however, put people first in everything. In the text, if Paul was a work-centered person, Barnabas was a considerate person who cared for others. That Barnabas was a kind, considerate person is clearly seen in how he introduced Saul to the apostles. Therefore, Paul too was ultimately someone who received grace through Barnabas's consideration. This was the situation immediately after Saul's conversion. Acts 9:26-27 states, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord and that the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. When the apostles heard that the persecutor Saul had been converted, they doubted his sincerity and were reluctant to meet him. At that time, Barnabas stepped forward and skillfully served as a bridge, building the relational connection to introduce him. Then Saul lived in seclusion for about 10 years in Arabia and his hometown. Later, when Barnabas was serving as pastor of the church in Antioch, he remembered Saul. After a long journey of 190 kilometers to Tarsus, his hometown, where Saul lived, he met him and brought him to Antioch to work together. It was Barnabas who paved the way for Paul to fully enter the field of ministry. What is remarkable is that Barnabas, knowing that Paul, a Pharisee by background, was outstanding, showed no sign of jealousy. He even passed on his leadership position to Paul. Thus, from Acts chapter 13 onward, we see the leadership role shift completely from Barnabas to Paul. For those who live task-centered, the task itself is indeed important. But for those who are people-centered, the people connected to the task are more important than the task itself. Paul argued that God's work is more important, so he should not take Mark, who hinders God's work. Barnabas, valuing people, insisted on giving him more opportunity. In any case, the two clashed and argued sharply over the issue of Mark. In zoology, wild chickens don't have a strong pecking order, but chickens confined in coops have a strict hierarchy and fight frequently. Roosters living in the jungle are said to stand guard for the hens under their command, and find food and sleeping spots for them. Chickens help each other when searching for food, and call their family members when they find grain. The pecking order only strongly activates when two chickens simultaneously try to eat the same grain. Conversely, chickens living in large coops have a strong pecking order, forcing oppression and submission whenever they meet. High-ranking chickens pack and torment lower-ranking ones for no reason. They are weak to the strong and strong to the weak. Though they are the same species of chicken, free-range chickens and caged chickens are different. The evil devil is obsessed with sowing seeds of discord. Therefore, the more disputes arise, the more believers must stay alert in prayer and resist the devil's schemes. Galatians chapter 5:15 states, "If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other." Therefore, believers must strive humbly for reconciliation, rather than contention. How wonderful it would be if, in our faith life both in the world and within the church, we could become one, helping each other, living in harmony and joy. We know this is good, yet putting it into practice is difficult. To achieve harmony and unity, we must first not cling excessively to our own opinions, but listen to others' perspectives. We must also recognize our own flaws and shortcomings and remain humble. Furthermore, even when conflicts arise among brothers, prompt reconciliation allows us to live the life the Lord desires. If we stubbornly cling to our own ideas, strife and division arise. Verses 37 to 40, Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia, and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. What was the reason the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, fought so fiercely, neither yielding to the other's argument? It was over whether to take John, also called Mark, who had accompanied them on the first missionary journey. In other words, the reason these two men, who had worked together so effectively to accomplish good, reached such an extreme situation was precisely because neither would yield to the other's argument. Paul argued that Mark John was untrustworthy and should be excluded from the second missionary team. He contended that taking the weak-willed Mark back into the mission field, where unpredictable dangers awaited, was like carrying a ticking time bomb and absolutely unacceptable. However, Barnabas disagreed. Even though Mark John had made a serious mistake before, Barnabas believed he had sufficiently repented and his faith had grown. He argued that giving him another chance would allow him to make amends for his past error. Both men had valid points. Their arguments stemmed from loyalty to the Lord. The regret is that both stubbornly clung to their own positions, refusing any compromise, ultimately causing great distress to the church. It was simply a difference of opinion arising from both men's earnest desire to serve the Lord's work more effectively. Second, failing to accept slight differences in each other's thoughts and values can lead to division. Therefore, we must have a broad perspective of tolerance in the Lord. The reason Paul and Barnabas quarreled was very simple. It wasn't a doctrinal issue, but rather should we take Mark with us or not? Paul and Barnabas went to the Jerusalem Council to resolve the issues of circumcision, the law, and salvation that had troubled the Antioch church. How joyful that must have been. Paul and Barnabas discussed, now that the important matters are settled, how about we embark on a second missionary journey? But they became stuck on the issue of Mark. Paul argued that he could not trust someone who had carelessly abandoned his post during such crucial ministry, while Barnabas insisted that since he was still young, they should forgive him once, admonish him, and take him along again. But they could not reconcile their differences, so each chose his own companions and set out on separate missionary journeys. To prevent such a situation, we must be able to find common ground. Compromise and service must be the foundation. The Bible shows that throughout history, sinful humanity has always experienced conflict and division. Yet there are accounts where such conflict was overcome, and God's blessing followed. In Genesis chapter 13, we see the scene where Abram and his nephew Lot part ways. They had lived together, but deep conflict arose between them in a foreign land. As Abraham and Lot's livestock grew increasingly numerous, their conflict deepened over the issue of securing the best pasture land. When their possessions were few, there was no problem, but as their wealth increased, cohabitation became difficult. So Abraham made a decision. Since we are relatives, let us not quarrel even in a foreign land. He then gave Lot the choice. In Genesis chapter 13:9, he said, "Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." At that moment, Lot looked up and gazed upon the land of Sor. It was a place abundant with water, as fertile as the land of Egypt. What did Lot see? He was looking at a place that looked good to his eyes. That place was none other than Sodom, the most notorious city of debauchery at the time. Though Lot believed in God, he still chose based on worldly standards of beauty. He chose to live enjoying worldly pleasures rather than living by faith. Do we not also, while claiming to serve the Lord, often make choices based on worldly standards of what looks good at critical moments? So, we often live with the ropes of our lives tied to the world. We may say we are moving toward heaven, yet we still often look at things by our own methods, according to our own plans, with secular values. But look at Abraham. Abraham had no choice. Lot chose first, and Abraham took what was left. Genesis chapter 13:14 states, "The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west." Where was Abraham standing? It was the lonely place after Lot left. He stood in a barren wilderness, far from fertility or material comfort. Yet God declared, "What you see from where you stand is not the entirety of your life." He revealed the amazing plan, dream, and vision hidden behind what was visible. Though the place where you are may be a scene of loneliness, solitude, and despair where nothing seems to exist, the Lord now told Abraham to lift up his eyes. What does this mean? It means do not look at your circumstances, but lift up your eyes toward the very God who created the universe and all things, who reigns and rules over this world even today, beyond your circumstances. In verse 39, it says, "They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company." Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but conflict exists to be overcome. People must understand that conflicts can arise at any time. This is because each person's thoughts and values differ slightly. When different people gather together, it is only natural that they will clash or rub against one another. Therefore, people of faith should anticipate this aspect and, when conflict arises, use it as an opportunity to upgrade and mature. Even prayerful, spirit-filled gospel missionaries can sometimes have differing thoughts and opinions. Because they are different, they may argue over other issues. People often assume that it's those who haven't been attending church long or who are immature who argue. While it's true that such individuals often do argue, it's important to remember that mature people, like Paul and Barnabas, can also sometimes argue. Are different opinions being expressed within your community regarding a specific matter? Even so, you shouldn't be too disappointed or blame yourself. Such things happened even in the days of Paul and Barnabas. The key is to acknowledge each other's differences and seek solutions. Therefore, when conflict arises, people of faith must first recognize each other's differences. Here, different and wrong have entirely different meanings. What is the difference? Wrong involves judging right and wrong and applies to truth, that is, unchanging facts. Different, however, involves acknowledging individual differences and can be broadly applied to issues that are not matters of truth. So, is the question of whether Mark John should accompany them on the missionary journey a matter of right and wrong? No. It was an issue where diverse opinions could exist. Therefore, to resolve this issue, which approach should we take, wrong or different? It is an issue to be approached as different. That is, they should have sought the best solution while acknowledging each other's differences. Unfortunately, Paul and Barnabas approached it from the perspective of wrong, not different. Consequently, emotional conflict arose. In verse 39, it states, "They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company." Yet, if they had set aside their emotions and engaged in dialogue by acknowledging each other's strengths and weaknesses, they could have found a solution. Paul's strength was his bold willingness to sacrifice minor considerations for the sake of a greater cause, focusing solely on the goal. What, then, was his weakness? He reacted too harshly to a single mistake. Barnabas's strength was his gentle character that reconciled many people. His weakness, however, was a tendency toward indecisiveness. Had the two recognized each other's strengths and weaknesses, the situation would have unfolded quite differently. For instance, in Paul's case, he could have given Mark John one more chance. If he caused trouble again, it wouldn't have been too late to completely exclude him from the evangelism team. And in Barnabas's case, since this wasn't necessarily his only chance, he could have yielded to Paul. If another opportunity arose later, it wouldn't have been too late to recommend Mark John again. Before seeking the root of the problem, are we reading the other person's strengths and weaknesses, temperament, or inclinations? Even if our hearts are reluctant, are we giving repeated chances and persuading? If this isn't the only chance, are we sometimes yielding? Therefore, may you realize that conflict exists not to be abandoned but to be overcome, and may you wisely overcome it well, in the name of the Lord. Third, experiencing conflict provides people with opportunities to gradually mature. If there was one person who weighed most heavily on Paul throughout his life, it was likely Barnabas. When Paul entered Jerusalem after his conversion on the Damascus road, everyone distrusted and guarded against him. Barnabas was the one who introduced such a Paul to the Jerusalem church. When Paul was persecuted and fled to his hometown of Tarsus, living in obscurity for 10 years, it was Barnabas sent to Antioch who personally traveled to Tarsus and appointed Paul as a leader of the Antioch church. Today's Paul is unimaginable without Barnabas. Yet Paul quarreled with Barnabas and parted ways. Thus, a burden must have always weighed on Paul's heart. Paul, who had hurt Mark John by calling him useless for the mission, unqualified for the mission, did not want Mark John to live carrying that wound. He did not want to be remembered by him as the one who inflicted that wound. Therefore, in 2 Timothy chapter 4:11, he said, "Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry." Now Paul introduces Mark John as someone who has been beneficial to him. As he does so, Paul was earnestly seeking Mark near the end of his life. Standing at the threshold of life's final chapter with Mark, he desired to dwell with him, to resolve the lingering resentment in each other's hearts, and to have one more opportunity to love him through God's teaching and love. What is astonishing is that Mark, who had fled out of cowardice and fear, was restored by God's grace and later wrote the Gospel of Mark. This shows that God is always the God who gives another chance. No matter what mistakes we make, no matter how cowardly we act, even if we commit grave sins and feel abandoned by people and God, what we must remember is that our God desires to restore us and use us again. He desires to give us another chance. God himself declared in Hebrews chapter 13:5, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." Later, when Paul and Barnabas came up to the Jerusalem church to give their first missionary report, Mark must have felt both ashamed and deeply sorry. He must have deeply regretted, thinking, how much better it would have been if I had stayed with them to the end. Why couldn't I endure to the end? Why did I give up halfway? He was utterly frustrated. Seeing this, Barnabas proposed giving Mark John another chance to overcome his frustration. At that time, Mark John likely made a promise like, "This time, I won't act like my weak self of the past, I will fulfill the mission to the end." This might have been especially true since Barnabas was Mark John's uncle. And Barnabas thought, we must let Mark John successfully complete this missionary journey. This time, making him a great worker for the church, but Paul vehemently opposed it. Ultimately, they had a fierce argument and parted ways. Then, in Acts 16, the evangelistic team of Paul and Silas faced persecution in Philippi. They were accused, flogged severely, and thrown into a dungeon with their feet fastened in stocks. At this point, one wonders if Mark John had been with them, could he have endured to the end and even sung hymns in the middle of the night? Moreover, when no one trusted Mark John, not even Paul himself, Barnabas was the one who believed in him. Barnabas did not abandon Mark. When Paul was shouting that Mark was unacceptable, Barnabas likely responded quietly, "Just as I believed in you, Paul, I believe in Mark." It was because of this Barnabas that Mark could become Mark. And in a way, Paul didn't realize that he himself was someone even harder to tolerate than Mark John. Realizing this later, he wrote in Philippians 2:3, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility value others above yourselves." Ultimately, we see that both Paul and Mark John matured and were established as men of God. God is the one who works all things together for good, despite the many flaws and mistakes of his workers. Romans chapter 8:28 states, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." I pray in the name of the Lord that your rough edges may be smoothed and that you may be established as a person of God.